Having familiarized ourselves with the personality of Justinian the Great and his wife Theodora, let us begin to study the first years of his reign. Almost immediately after his official accession, Justinian appoints a talented official Tribonian as the head of the commission, which for 5 years will go through all the laws adopted earlier by different emperors and collect one large body of laws, Corpus, juris, civilis, or the Code of Justinian. A modern empire needs modern laws, doesn't it? Code for 1,000 years will be a model for many states, and Byzantium he gave clear and uniform laws, a thing very important when you manage a huge country. The state at that time was at war in the east. The Sassanid Empire under the leadership of Shahinshah Kavad began a creeping annexation of the last semi-independent state of Transcaucasia, Lazika. This is the modern seacoast of Georgia. At the same time in Iberia, this is the modern center of Georgia. Everyone was forcibly converted to Zoroastrianism, a very strange thing, as originally Zoroastrianism was not a proselytizing religion at all. It was impossible to allow this. Persians raided, Byzantium built fortresses. Talented Byzantine commander Belisarius, just for a few years of this war from a simple soldier, grew up to the commander of the army and inflicted on the Persians several serious defeats. Kavad gathered another army of victory. Under the command of Azareth, Persians were going to invade Syria to finally turn the tide of the war in their favor. Approaching the goal, Azareth met the army of Belisarius, which was not inferior to him in numbers, and both commanders began to maneuver, and Belisarius simply waited until the Persians exhausted and returned to their country, and Azareth hoped to bypass the Byzantines and break into rich Syria. The Byzantine army was not ready for the strange maneuvers and began to grumble, so that Belisarius eventually gave in and took the battle near modern Raqqa, which is in Syria. The battle was extremely unsuccessful for the Byzantines. The Persian cavalry overturned the flank of the empire and surrounded Belisarius's army, pinning it to the Euphrates River. Byzantine infantry stood in a semicircle, facing the river. There was nowhere to retreat. Here Azareth, who apparently had not read the treatise The Art of War, made a mistake and decided that now he would interrupt the cornered opponents. The Persians went on the attack. Byzantines had nowhere to go, and they began to stubbornly defend. Until evening, Azareth threw his soldiers in the attack against the infantry and cavalry Belisarius. And when night came and the battle was over, the locals brought boats and Byzantines crossed to the other side. The losses of the attackers were greater than those of the defenders. Both armies were incapable of fighting, so both rulers dismissed their commanders-in-chief and appointed new ones for the next year's campaign. The following year the war did not continue, as Kavad was succeeded by his son Khosrow, who was keen to consolidate power at home and made peace with Justinian on the terms of the status quo. This peace was called eternal, as there was no stipulation of the end of the treaty. But even earlier there was a huge revolt in the capital of the empire, in which the Venetians and Praetorians tried to remind the emperor that it was they who had elected his uncle to the throne and continued to consider themselves the source of power in the empire, and therefore they should be reckoned with. The excitement of the parties, these fans at the races, already shook different cities of the empire during the reign of Justinian. Immediately, during one of the games, the Praetorians began to demand something from the emperor, and a quarrel began. In the evening, the emperor ordered to seize and execute especially distinguished troublemakers. The execution began. One man was actually executed, and the rope of the other 2 men snapped. Everyone understands that it was sabotage of the emperor's order, but the crowd shouted about the ancient custom not to execute a person repeatedly if the heavens had mercy on them. The condemned took refuge in the temple, and the next day the spectators began to demand from the emperor a pardon for these troublemakers. Justinian remained silent. In response to such stubbornness from the emperor, the parties of the Hippodrome became angry that they were not being obeyed, immediately formed an alliance and revolted. A huge armed crowd of citizens destroyed all government buildings except the emperor's palace, where Justinian and his wife took refuge and barricaded themselves with loyal soldiers. The gates of the prison were captured and opened. The debt books were burned. Fires destroyed the capital. Many temples were burned. Days passed and the riot did not subside. Justinian thought to flee the city, but Theodora showed character and forced him to stay. Justinian, delaying time, fulfilled the demands of the rebels and dismissed officials undesirable to the rebels. But the appetite of people only grew. 4 days passed and they demanded a new ruler. The rebels gathered again in the stadium and elected a new emperor, the nephew of the former emperor Anastasius, Hypatius. Hypatius, by the way, was against it, but the crowd literally by force solemnly crowned him. At this moment it turned out that one of Justinian's generals, eunuch Narses, in advance snuck to the leaders of the rebels and partially bribed them. The senators betrayed the people. The exits to the hippodrome were blocked by troops loyal to Justinian. The small but well-motivated troops of Belisarius and Munda carried out a bloody massacre in the stadium, while the troops of Narses and the senators who had sold out to him attacked the gawkers who had gathered around the stadium. Soon the rebellion was crushed. Gruesome and bloody, the brutally suppressed revolt strengthened the power of the emperor enormously. All the senators who had wavered in their loyalty lost their office and property. It is funny that good-hearted Justinian after some time changed his mind to punish the remaining relatives of Anastasius and returned them property and posts. As for Hypatius, he was executed. He was shown to the people for edification, after which the widow was allowed to hold a funeral. Justinian restored back all his favorite officials. Tribonian continued to make laws, and hated by the niggers for greed, John of Cappadocia continued to collect taxes and to supervise the construction of a new temple of St. Sophia in place of the burned, exactly in the same place. Domestic affairs were settled, the threat from Persia was eliminated, and Justinian turned his gaze to the west, where in the country of the Vandals. The last king of the Vandals and longtime pal of Justinian was overthrown for the first time in the kingdom's history by a relative, the mean and heartless Helamer. The Vandals rebelled after another defeat at the hands of the Berbers, as a result of which their kingdom was increasingly shrinking around Carthage. Helamer, though he was the loudest in his outrage, could not regain his lost cities in Africa. Moreover, after the coup his country began to fall to pieces. Viceroy in Libya declared independence and immediately asked under the wing of Byzantium. Sardinia rebelled. Helamer began to gather an army to conquer Sardinia back. The kingdom of Vandals not only offended the emperor's friend, but already at all faintly resembled a state. Justinian decided on an overseas campaign, and this decision caused horror among his advisors, who remembered well how 100 years ago the Vandals burned the fleet of Byzantium. Nevertheless, preparations for the operation began. How the war with the Vandals we'll go see in the next video.